guys on that ship. They were all young men. And he said that the Indians could carry loads twice as heavy as their men, uphill and downhill an English mile. Well, if you start on the beach here, and if you walk straight up to the very top of the mountain, which is here, now this is a topographical map, so you can't really tell. But if you walk straight from the beach to the top of the mountain, it's 5,000 feet, which was an English mile. And there's no other place that has anything like that. And that's a very, very telling point, I think, too. The next thing is what did they really do on the Neahkahnie Mountain? Well, because if you remember the geomorphous triangulation that I showed, this was a triangulation map from William Bourne in 1578. He was also an Englishman, and it's in English. And it's the same sort of a layout that Francis Fletcher or that geomorphous showed, and it's the same sort of a layout that's on Neahkahnie Mountain. And these are the types of crude instruments at the time that they used. This is a cross staff. I don't know if anyone's ever seen a cross staff. They're not used anymore. But basically, that's out of the Tectonican book, how to use a cross staff. And then this is an astrolabe, which is a pretty crude instrument also. You look through this end, and you line it up right here, and the whole thing was pretty crude. I can't tell you exactly how to use these because I'm not a surveyor, but these are the instruments they were using. And then they used a compass, and they used a rope or a chain. They didn't even have a Gunther's chain, because the Gunther's chain, if anyone's familiar with that, wasn't invented until after this period too. So, and let's see, what do we have next? Francis Drake's survey on the Neahkahnie Mountain. It was a symbolic sovereign act. It was claiming the land for Queen Elizabeth. And who else could have done this? Cabillo and Ferrillo. Cabillo died before he got back to Spain, or back to Acapulco. They came up as far as 42.5 degrees, and they didn't even land there. If you know who these people are, they were Spaniards, and that's as far north as they got, and 42.5 degrees is about the Oregon border, if anyone knows that, north latitude. The next explorer wasn't until 1774, which was almost 200 years afterwards, and Perez actually just sailed by and they went to Alaska. In fact, all the Spanish totally ignored the areas from pretty much from 38 to 48 degrees. They started after 48 degrees, essentially recognizing Drake's claim. And then Cook in Vancouver, they never landed in the Nehalem Bay. The only person that was even close was Broughton when he sailed up this river right here that we're so proud to be standing next to. And that was in 1592, and they did totally different types of surveys. They did running surveys. They would measure one area, then measure another area, and then they didn't do anything, these sort of things. Cook wasn't even close. And then the survey is in it's not in Spanish, it's in English with some Greek symbols too. So, button. Nehalem Indians. These are the things I like. I like the Indians. I was back in the Smithsonian last July, and I was looking for some of the things that Wilkes had taken back there. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Wilkes, Lieutenant Wilkes, when he went through here. And then, I don't remember the year actually right off the top of my head. And then Swan, who was up in Shoalwater for a number of years in the 1850s. So they have two great collections back in the Smithsonian from those people from this area. And some of the things that they have fireweed on them. And the fireweed is this up in here. Now some of this is feathers, and some of this is goat hair, and some of it is dog hair, but some of it is also fireweed. And Francis Fletcher talks about, in his book, he talks about on their cowls or their hats that were stuck with feathers and covered with certain down, and I have the down in the car and I forgot to bring it in, but it's you all seen it, I'm sure, which grows up in the country much like a herb, like our lettuce. Well, most people think lettuce is like this. Well, no, lettuce is not like this. Lettuce is like this when you let it go to seed. I mean, we buy it at the store. We buy seed at the store, little packages. But in those days, you know, the English had to let half their crop or a third of their crop go to seed. And this is what it looks like when it goes to seed. And it looks very much like fireweed. Now, fireweed is the first thing that grows alongside any sort of burnt out area. In fact, you've probably seen it up and down the highway. That's how I'd actually discovered this. I watched it for 3 years grow and then seed, and I stopped one day and I said, gee, that's kind of interesting. That looks pretty downy, you know, and I pulled over and I felt it, and yeah, I mean, it's down and it's very, very fine. The California people use thistle, which, if you know what thistle is, that stuff is nothing like this. But they have to have something that's in their stories. But and what's rather interesting about this, and that I made a presentation down in Newport, April, I think it was last year or the year before, and at the same time, Melissa Darby, who was an archaeologist in Portland, made a presentation also, and she had discovered the same thing. And her presentation was about Drake, and she's working with someone down in Wales Cove, but she came up with the same thing. In fact, someone said, well, we stole it from each other. No, we both discovered it separately, so, you know, it was great. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, Neahkahnie Mountain, the Indians used to burn it off because it was easier to hunt, and it was also easier to pick the fireweed too further down. Another thing that we talk, or Francis Fletcher talks about, is the root, which we call pata. We know it as wapata or pato or wapata, however you want to pronounce it. There are different ways, but I think a reasonable person would say that those two words are the same. In his book, that's the way the Englishman in 1628 wrote it, as P-E-T-A-H. And it talks about the Indians making it into a meal, either cooked or eaten raw. Now, this is very interesting. When I spoke this same sort of a talk at OMSI for the Oregon Archaeological Society, I asked, how many people here have eaten wapatu? And I asked the same question. But I had about 40 people out of the 150 people raise their hand. So if you're familiar with Lewis and Clark, and I'm sure you are, they had Salvi's Island named as Wapatu Island because there was a lot of it on Salvi's Island at one time. There still is, actually, too. It's all gone down in Nehalem because of different development and things. And I hope you can see that picture right there. It's not very bright, but they're about the size of a small egg, and they're sort of segmented, and I have this growing in my backyard, by the way, in a 5-gallon drum. So, and oh, by the way, it's very tasty too. Yeah. Oh, and I want to go back there for a second. The California people, just to kind of give you an idea, they use the word, instead of patu, they use the word creed for their Indians, because the Indians down there were making things out of acorns, and they were cooking acorns. And Sermano, Rodrigo Sermano, who actually crashed his San Agustin Spanish galleon in 1595 at Point Reyes. That's why the California people take Drake and try to combine all those little artifacts down there and say that these were Drake's artifacts. But Sermano describes the things that the Indians were eating as bitter. And Fletcher didn't describe them as bitter, and wapatu is not bitter, it's rather sweet. I'd eat it every day. If it was available, quite honestly, I wouldn't mind at all. So it wasn't anything like it. So the Islands of St. James. The reason why these are called the Islands of St. James by Francis Fletcher and Drake is that's the day they landed on those islands. And by the Spanish or the English calendar of 1595, that was July 24th, or July 23rd. Add 10 days to the new calendar, which makes it actually August 3rd. So they call these the Islands of St. James. And this is how he described it in the World and Compass. This is not far from this harbor lies, harbor being Nehalem Bay, lies certain islands called St. James, having plentiful of store of seals and birds, and that's the most important thing, seals and birds. This Three Arch Rocks became the first wildlife refuge in 1907 when Teddy Roosevelt designated that, and the reason why is because, well, in those days there were plenty of seals and birds, and you know the resources were unlimited, and tourists would come down and shoot the birds and the seals just for fun, for sport, and so that's the reason why they made it a refuge. If we compare these to the Farloons or Farlands, In California, because there are some islands off of the California area there, Point Reyes, they try to say that's where Drake was. In fact, they even have a monument down there for that too. But when Sermano was there, having crashed his ship, hungry, still have men in an open boat, he decided to leave and go back to Acapulco, and he eventually made it back. He ignored the far lands because when he was coming in, he noticed they were barren, and that's the way he described them. So barren means there aren't very many birds and seals out there for food, especially if you're hungry. So another example of this being a better location. Now, they're going to talk about the Honduras Map. Now, this is another great area here, too. The Honduras Map is another map that was done in 1590, and it was actually the first copper-pressed map by the Jacques Honduras. And this is actually showing the track of, let's see if we can see where that is, how well we can see that. Not so well. Well, anyway, it shows a line going around here, and it goes 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 up here, and it goes down here, and it goes and eventually goes around South America somewhere over here and back home. But that's showing the voyage of Drake and Cavendish, and that was to celebrate them. And then in each corner, these are called broadsides. It's a representation of things that happened during the voyage. And everyone agrees that this is a wonderful representation. This is a wonderful representation. This is a wonderful reputation. And this, people aren't so sure of. This is supposed to be Portus Nova Albion, which means the port of New England. And if we look at this a little closer, what that says on the bottom of this in Latin, or not Latin, it's anyway, Dutch. It says Drake repaired his ship here. Okay. Now this is rather interesting. If you take that and well, I made it a little larger. Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Actually, there are a number of different areas, and I'll show that in a second here. Let's see. The next one. Here we go. This is an overlay of the Honduras Map broadside on top of Nehalem Bay. Now, all I did was just lay it right over the top of it. And if you notice here, this looks like this. Now, in those days, they didn't have airplanes. We all realize that. Okay. So someone drew this over around here. Now, if you're familiar with the area, this is all hilly or mountainous here. If you're familiar with the area, there's 3 hills right here, right here, right here that are there on the map that are in Nehalem Bay if you're looking at it from out here. All this area right here is just a sand spit. Now, today, that's the state park, and that was planted in the early 1960s by the state. So you have a lot of trees out there. But Lewis and Clark's Atlas Map 85, Map 85 shows this as just 3 little dots, dot, dot, dot. So in those days, it really didn't mean much. This is a known archaeological site showing an Indian here. This is a known archaeological site. These are known archaeological sites right here too. And this is where the fort is. Now, this map is a little bit fuzzy just because it's blown up, but all those little lines like this right here, that represents sand where water would have been. And if you notice, there's all water all around here too. And the same way along the fort over here too, where he built his fort. And this is where he repaired his ship. And by the way, Neahkahnie, in case you don't realize it, is just right here, borders it right here too. So, and then this is how the California contingency says that Drake's Bay lines up, or the Honduras Map lines up. They actually have to turn it upside down to fit, and here they have to make it whatever degree that is, 190 degrees. And everyone's supposed to believe that, that's real. This is right out of their book, so I mean, I'm not changing anything on this stuff. Now I'll get to the John Drake deposition. Now, John Drake, this is out of Lady Drake's book, which is documented all over the place. And this is in English, but the Spanish version is also there too. And it says, these islands that they were talking about were situated between 46 and 48. And they stayed there for 5 weeks. And that lies at 48 degrees with the name of New England. So So John Drake said they were at 48 degrees. The California contingency says they were never further than 43. As a matter of fact, they've actually had a plaque placed at Coos Bay. If you're all familiar with that, I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. There's a plaque at Coos Bay, South Cove, that said that Francis Drake came here at Coos Bay because he landed there because of a bad bay, and then from there he went to California and spent the 5 weeks in California. And they deny that it was ever at 48 degrees latitude. And then this was the second deposition that he gave in 1587. And he talks about that they repaired the ship, the large ship, and left the one from Nicaragua, which they had captured, which was Talos bark, and left it there and went away, and the Indians were sad. So what he's saying here is that they left the bark, the two-masted ship, in Nehalem Bay or very near there. I believe off the schedule, if you look on your schedule, Scott Williams and John Dubé, which I know very well, who have been looking for a galleon, or actually doing work on a galleon in Nehalem Bay for the last 4 or 5 years, eventually are aware of this, and they've been looking, and they've found a number of anomalies out in the water along the Nehalem Bay and Manzanita, which they're hoping to find more of and dive for, I think, this coming year. So hopefully, I'm thinking, hopefully they'll find out that one of these things or anomalies that are out there is Talos bark. And this is another interesting thing. A fellow